Thank you very much, Patrick Kelly, for drawing together so many of the themes of our conference so effectively. My friend and colleague, Dan Philpott, and I are going to try to undertake the very difficult but necessary task of trying to draw into very brief remarks our sense of some of the major points that have emerged in the course of our discussion, and also points that have emerged from the research of our outstanding scholars from whom you've heard in the course of the conference. I'm going to make three very brief points. My colleague Dan Philpott will then make one big point, and then we will move on and close the conference. It really is a daunting task to draw together so many important remarks, stories that have moved us profoundly in the course of these past 3 days, but again, it's necessary to do so. First point I want to make is that the pressures Christians face around the world range widely in their nature and severity, and they range widely in terms of the regimes in which they occur. Caesar wields the sword of persecution in very different ways, sometimes in very overt and violent ways, sometimes in very subtle ways. And frequently in our world today, it is not Caesar wielding the sword of persecution, but non-state actors, often motivated by religious ideology. In some cases, that ideology is Islamist, but in many other cases, it derives from other forms of religious nationalism. In many cases, the pressures Christians face do not rise to the level of persecution. Still, these pressures, such as the ones Elizabeth Prodromou eloquently described yesterday concerning Christians in Turkey or in northern Cyprus, may threaten the ability of Christians to maintain a public institutional presence in society from one generation to the next, and even to preserve the physical history of Christianity. Indeed, the very ability to preserve any concrete historical memory of Christianity, the importance of which Andrea Riccardi beautifully discussed on our first day, may be endangered in many contexts. In addition, Christians face pressures under a variety of authoritarian regimes. It's certainly true, but it's also emerged in the course of our conference that democracy is no guarantee of security for Christians. In several contexts, we are witnessing a dynamic in which robust democracy actually facilitates the tyranny of religious majorities in countries such as Iraq and Indonesia. Christians face pressures not only in Muslim-majority countries, but in Christian-majority countries, such as Russia, Buddhist-majority countries, such as Sri Lanka and Burma, and Hindu-majority countries, such as India and Nepal. Finally, Reg Reimer reminded us yesterday that millions of Christians still live under some variant of communism, and many of these Christians face significant restrictions, as well as the kind of outright brutality that Reg Reimer movingly described in the case of a group of evangelical lawyers in Vietnam. Second point, to this wide diversity of pressures, Christians have developed a wide diversity of responses. If the Caesars of today, whether state actors or non-state actors, wield the sword of persecution in different ways and with differing degrees of severity, Christians are engaging these very different Caesars in very different kinds of ways and with very different kinds of strategies and consequences. Responses to persecution can be ranged along a continuum from reactive to proactive, depending on the level of assertiveness involved. We discern three categories. First, there are strategies of survival. Second, there are strategies of construction. Third, there are strategies of confrontation. In the first category, strategies of survival, Christian communities are simply trying to stay alive, usually in highly repressive circumstances. Flight or taking cover exemplifies this strategy well, as do what some of our scholars have called coping strategies, or strategies of endurance, that are designed just to keep a repressive regime at bay and a Christian community alive and present in a society. Sometimes these strategies can include a determination to remain in situations of persecution in order to preserve a Christian legacy. They might also include demonstrating patriotism, adaptation to a hegemonic culture, feigning conversion to the dominant religion, or bandwagoning, with a political regime or the authorities of a dominant religion. In the second category, strategies of construction, Christian communities are more assertive and proactive. They build relationships and structures that give them strength and autonomy in a repressive environment, but they do not directly confront or oppose the given regime or the given non-state persecutor. Such strategies may well involve risk. They might include building a fresh conceptual and theological understanding of persecution, including why it is wrong or unjust, constructing a response of forgiveness and mercy, constructing dialogue and partnerships with other Christian churches or members of other faiths, constructing partnerships outside the country, providing social services on the civil society level, and vigorously carrying out characteristic Christian activities such as worship, education, and evangelization, the last of those often being the most dangerous. Even under opposition and terrible pressure, as in the moving case of Father Bernard Kinvi in the Central African Republic, who was determined to stay behind in order to maintain the hospital and medical care that he felt called to maintain in his village. In the third category, strategies of confrontation, Christian communities actively oppose the persecutors. These might include nonviolent protest, armed resistance, making public arguments against the state's policies, documenting human rights abuses, or supporting the overthrow of the regime, or intentionally accepting imprisonment or martyrdom. While confrontation strategies are the most risky and dangerous category as a rule, they are more or less dangerous, of course, given the kind of regime involved. In democratic or semi-democratic settings, Christian communities sometimes engage in quite vigorous political argumentation, as they do in India, and to a lesser but still significant degree in Pakistan and Indonesia, though still not without risk. It must be emphasized in presenting this rather rough typology of responses that, of course, to analyze and differentiate these responses is in no way to imply any kind of moral or spiritual judgment on any of them. Third and finally, before I turn the podium over to Dan Philpott, these different ways Christians respond to persecution are, of course, greatly conditioned by the level and severity of the persecution they face, but not exhaustively. Often, as we have heard throughout this conference, against the odds and amidst horrific opposition, Christians have demonstrated a remarkable degree of intentionality, of agency, and creativity in their responses to persecution. Christians, even under the severest pressures, have not been merely mute or inert or passive victims. And Helen Berhane's beautiful song was a striking exemplification of the fact that she could find a voice even in a shipping container in the middle of the Eritrean desert. In a remarkable number of cases, they have proven to be active witnesses and constructive agents of change. Being small and beleaguered does not make flight or mere coping strategies inevitable. Consider Paul Batti, whom we heard from at this conference, who made the deliberate choice to leave a comfortable life in Italy after his brother Shabazz Batti was assassinated, precisely to take up his brother's very dangerous work of witness for peace and justice. Or again, consider Father Kinvi, who chose to stay in his village and serve his people when the Seleka guerrillas arrived, even when he had the opportunity to flee.
We have talked about how beleaguered Christian communities are responding to often horrific and growing persecution, but how should we respond? The first epistle of Peter says that you know that your brothers and sisters in all the world are undergoing the same kinds of suffering. Today, as this conference has come to an end, we know better what persecuted Christians in all the world are suffering. But what are we doing about it? Here are some brief recommendations. First, churches in the non-persecuted part of the world, so to speak, that's never a sharp distinction, but need to do far more to educate, be aware of, and most importantly, as Cardinal Bo exhorted us, to pray for persecuted communities. The Under Caesar's Sword Project will be developing educational materials for churches and schools. Second, Christians in the religiously free part of the world, so to speak, can support persecuted communities directly through resources, visits, and personal connections. This should always be done with guidance from the communities themselves and in cooperation with those who have worked with them over the long term and know the territory. Third, support government policies that promote religious freedom, as we heard about in our last panel. We applaud broadly the foreign policy of religious freedom that our own country has pursued since 1998. But we also applaud that numerous other democracies are adopting such policies and call for multilateral cooperation between them. We also call for foreign policies that do not merely operate on the high level of central governments, but work to create support for religious freedom within countries. And Ambassadors Bennett and Saperstein have pursued exactly this kind of effort. Fourth, we should work strenuously for the religious freedom of all peoples, not just Christians. This is critical not only for its own sake, but also for the very cause of defending Christians, which will accrue credibility and strength. Fifth, continue to build broad constituencies for supporting persecuted Christians and religious freedom in general. Here at this conference, we have brought together patriarchs and professors, ambassadors and analysts. We have heard from the head as well as from the heart. We all need one another. And so let us deepen the friendships we have built and renewed here and go forth in solidarity with our suffering brothers and sisters. Friends, thank you all for being with us. God go with you, and please keep in touch as we build a movement for religious freedom. Thank you.